Friendship, for many, is a sacred bond, a chosen family built on a foundation of trust, loyalty, and shared history. We believe we know our closest friends better than anyone, that we can see into their hearts. But what if that foundation is a lie? What if the person you trust most in the world, the one you would turn to in your darkest hour, is the very architect of that darkness? The story you are about to hear is a chilling exploration of the ultimate betrayal. It is a tale of a perfect marriage, an unbreakable friendship, and a deadly deception that shatters them both, leaving a trail of blood and broken trust in its wake. Before we unravel this tragic web of secrets, if you are drawn to stories that probe the dark, complex depths of the human heart, be sure to subscribe to our channel and ring the notification bell. You will not want to miss the shocking truth we are about to uncover. Now, let us begin. The life that David and Laura Morgan had built was a quiet masterpiece of contentment. Their home, a restored craftsman bungalow on a tree-lined street, was a testament to their shared aesthetic: warm, inviting, and filled with light. David, an architect, saw the world in terms of structure, balance, and clean lines. He was a man of quiet thoughts and deep, steady emotions. Laura was the vibrant, chaotic, and beautiful life that filled the structures he built. She was a landscape painter, a woman who saw the world in strokes of bold color, her laughter a constant, melodic presence in their home. They were a perfect, complementary whole, a marriage that was the quiet envy of their friends. And at the very center of their shared world, a third indispensable pillar was Mark Thorne. Mark was not just David's best friend. He was a brother, a fixture, an extension of their family unit. Their friendship had been forged in childhood, a bond built on scraped knees, shared secrets, and the easy, unspoken understanding of two boys who had grown into men side by side. Where David was the thoughtful planner, Mark was the pragmatic doer. A successful building contractor, he was the man who turned David's architectural blueprints into tangible reality. He was handsome in a rugged, easygoing way, with a ready smile and a kind of grounded, dependable energy that people were naturally drawn to. He was a constant, welcome presence in the Morgans' home. He was there for Sunday barbecues, for late-night talks over whiskey after a long week, for every birthday and anniversary. He and David had a shorthand, a language of shared history that needed few words. With Laura, his relationship was one of a doting, protective older brother. He would tease her, help her with projects around the house, and always listen to her with a patient, indulgent smile. The three of them were a perfect, unshakable trinity. David had once joked that Mark was the steel reinforcement in the concrete foundation of his life. The joke, like all the best ones, was built on a profound truth. The day Laura disappeared, the world of quiet, predictable order began to tilt on its axis. It was a Wednesday. She had told David she was going for a hike, a solo trip to a familiar trail along the river that ran just outside of town, a place she often went to sketch and clear her head. She had kissed him goodbye that morning, her lips tasting of coffee and the sweet, familiar taste of his wife. "Be back by 4, she had said, her bright smile the last thing he saw as she walked out the door. At 5, he had felt the first, faint prickle of unease. At 6, the unease had sharpened into a real, cold knot of anxiety. He called her cell phone. It went straight to voicemail. He told himself she had just lost track of time, that her phone had died. But Laura was meticulous about time, about checking in. By 7, the anxiety had bloomed into a full-blown, sick-making panic. The first person he called, even before the police, was Mark. The man had answered on the second ring, his voice calm and reassuring. "I'm on my way," he'd said, and those 4 words had been a lifeline in a rising sea of terror. Mark had arrived in 10 minutes, his presence a solid, grounding force in the chaos of David's unraveling mind. It was Mark who had calmly suggested they check the trailhead. It was Mark who had spoken to the police, his voice steady and clear, providing the necessary details while David could only stammer, his thoughts a frantic, jumbled mess. The initial search yielded nothing but Laura's car, parked in its usual spot at the trailhead. There was no sign of a struggle. Her purse was still on the passenger seat. The police, led by a sharp, empathetic detective named Isabella Rossi, treated it with a serious but measured concern. A woman was missing, but in these first few hours, there was still the hope of a simple, rational explanation. She could have gotten lost. She could have fallen and injured herself. As night fell, a full-scale search and rescue operation was launched. David, his mind a maelstrom of horrific possibilities, was a wreck. He was desperate to join the search, to do something, but Mark had gently, firmly held him back. "You need to be here, Dave," he'd said, his hand a heavy, reassuring weight on David's shoulder. "You need to be here for when they find her. Let them do their jobs. I'll be your legs. I'll go." And he had. All through the long, cold night, while David sat by the phone, a prisoner in his own silent, empty house, Mark was out there with the search teams, a flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, his voice calling Laura's name until he was hoarse. He was the perfect friend, the perfect proxy for David's own helpless agony. He would return to the house every few hours to give David updates, his face grim with exhaustion but his resolve unwavering. He was David's rock. The next 2 days were a blur of sleepless, surreal horror. The search expanded. Volunteers from the town joined in. Laura's smiling face was on the local news, on flyers posted on every telephone pole. The house, once a sanctuary of peace, was now a command center of grief, filled with worried friends, concerned neighbors, and the quiet, professional presence of Detective Rossi and her team. Rossi was a calm, methodical presence in the storm. She interviewed David with a gentle but probing persistence. She asked about their marriage, about any recent arguments, any signs of depression or unusual behavior from Laura. The questions were standard, but they felt like a violation to David. His marriage was perfect. Laura was happy. There was no other explanation. Something terrible had happened to her in those woods. Through it all, Mark was a constant shadow at his side. He fielded the phone calls. He made coffee for the police. He sat with David in the long, silent hours, not offering empty platitudes, but just being there. A shared, silent presence that was more comforting than any words could be. He was living up to his name, the steel reinforcement, holding the entire crumbling structure of David's life together. On the third day, the hope that had been dwindling finally, brutally, died. A call came in from the sheriff's department of the next county downriver. A fisherman had found something snagged on a logjam about 10 miles downstream from the trail. A body. Detective Rossi drove David to the county morgue. Mark had insisted on coming with them, a silent bulwark in the passenger seat. The drive was a silent, 20-mile funeral procession. David felt a profound sense of disassociation, as if he were watching a movie of someone else's life. A terrible, tragic film that was about to reach its inevitable, heartbreaking conclusion. The room in the morgue was cold, sterile, and smelled of antiseptic. The coroner, a man with sad, tired eyes, pulled back the sheet. It was her, Laura. Her beautiful, vibrant face was pale and still, her skin bruised by the river's cold, rough embrace. The colors of her life had all been washed away, leaving only the stark, monochrome reality of death. David felt the world collapse into a single point of unbearable silent sound. He felt his legs give way, and the darkness rushed in to claim him. The last thing he was aware of was the strong, steady grip of Mark's arms, catching him, holding him up, the one solid thing left in a world that had been shattered into a million irreparable pieces. The perfect life was over. The unbreakable bond between the two men, however, now seemed more crucial, more necessary than ever. One was a man drowning in grief. The other was the selfless, loyal friend who would do anything to save him. The deception, in all its deadly, horrifying perfection, had just begun. The discovery of Laura's body was not an end to the nightmare, but a descent into a new, deeper, and more permanent level of hell. The initial, frantic terror of the unknown was replaced by the crushing, absolute weight of certainty. She was gone. The vibrant, laughing center of David's world had been extinguished, leaving behind a cold, silent void. The days that followed were a landscape of grief, a gray, featureless terrain that David navigated in a state of profound shock. The world outside continued its rhythms, the sun rose, the mail was delivered, cars drove past his house, but his own internal world had come to a complete and utter standstill. He moved through the motions of life like an automaton. He spoke to the police. He met with the funeral director. He accepted the casseroles and condolences from a steady stream of grieving friends and neighbors. But he was not truly there. He was a ghost in his own life, haunted by the phantom presence of his wife. Through it all, Mark was his anchor. He had practically moved into the Morgans' guest room, becoming the de facto caretaker of both the house and its broken owner. He was a masterpiece of selfless friendship. He managed the flood of visitors, answered the constantly ringing phone, and spoke to the press. His voice thick with a convincing, shared grief, shielding David from the morbid curiosity of the outside world. He would sit with David for hours in the darkened living room, the silence between them a heavy, comfortable blanket, a testament to a friendship that needed no words. He was, in every conceivable way, the perfect, grieving best friend. The official investigation, led by Detective Rossi, moved forward with a grim, methodical pace. The initial findings of the autopsy were released. Laura had not drowned. The cause of death was blunt force trauma to the back of the head. She had been murdered, and her body had been dumped in the river to be washed away, a brutal act designed to conceal a crime. The case was now officially a homicide. And with that official designation, the focus of the investigation, as it always did in such cases, shifted squarely onto the husband. Detective Rossi was a professional, her empathy tempered by a pragmatist's understanding of statistics. In the vast majority of cases where a woman was murdered, the killer was her husband or intimate partner. David Morgan, the grieving, shattered architect, was now her prime suspect. Her questioning of him became more pointed, more probing. She asked about life insurance policies. She asked about arguments, about any signs of jealousy or infidelity in their marriage. David, his mind still clouded by grief, answered her questions with a numb, cooperative honesty. Their marriage was perfect. There were no secrets. The life insurance was a standard policy they had taken out years ago. His answers were the truth, but he knew how they sounded. He was the husband, the one who stood to benefit financially, the one with the most to gain from her death. He was a walking, talking cliché of a suspect. It was Mark who acted as his shield, his advocate. He sat in on the interviews, his presence a silent, supportive challenge to Rossi's suspicions. He provided David with a rock-solid alibi for the time of the murder, confirming that he and David had been in a project meeting all afternoon, a meeting that was corroborated by 3 other people. "You're wasting your time, detective," Mark had said to Rossi, his voice a low, controlled growl of frustration. David loved his wife more than anything in this world. He would have died for her. You should be out there looking for the monster who did this, not harassing a man who has just had his entire world destroyed. Rossi had just looked at him, her gaze cool and unreadable. "I'm just doing my job, Mr. Thorne," she had said. "I look at everyone." But the shadow of suspicion clung to David, a cold, suffocating miasma. He saw it in the eyes of some of his neighbors, the way their expressions of sympathy were now tinged with a morbid, questioning curiosity. He was no longer just the grieving widower, he was a potential killer. The home that had once been a symbol of his and Laura's love now felt like a prison, a crime scene where he was the main exhibit. The funeral was a wrenching, public ordeal. The church was filled to capacity, a testament to how much Laura had been loved. David sat in the front pew, a hollowed-out man in a black suit, with Mark at his side, a steadfast, protective presence. David delivered the eulogy, his voice trembling, his words a broken, heartfelt tribute to the woman who had been his light. As he spoke, he looked out at the sea of tear-streaked faces, and he felt a profound and terrifying sense of isolation. He was the only one in the room who truly understood the depth of the loss, and he was the one they suspected of causing it. After the funeral, as people gathered at the house, sharing memories of Laura. The atmosphere was thick with a strange, dissonant mixture of grief and suspicion. David retreated into his study, unable to bear the pitying looks, the whispered conversations. Mark found him there, staring at the architectural plans for a house he would now never build with his wife. "They think I did it," David whispered, his voice a raw, broken thing. "They think I killed her." "They're fools," Mark said, his voice a low, fierce growl. He put a hand on David's shoulder, his grip firm. "I know you, Dave. I know who you are. And I know you didn't do this. And I am not going to rest until we find the bastard who did. I swear to you, we're going to get justice for her. Together." The words, the unwavering conviction in his friend's voice, were a balm on David's raw, wounded soul. In a world that had turned against him, in a world where he had lost everything, he still had Mark, his brother, the one person who knew the truth, who believed in him without question. He leaned into his friend's embrace, a man clinging to the last remaining pillar in the ruins of his life. Meanwhile, Detective Rossi was beginning to feel the first, faint stirrings of doubt about her primary suspect. David Morgan's grief was too profound, too genuine, to be a performance. His alibi was ironclad. And the preliminary forensics from the trail where Laura had disappeared had come back with nothing. No signs of a struggle, no DNA other than Laura's. The scene was too clean. The killer was careful, methodical. Her attention, almost unconsciously at first, began to drift to the other man in the equation. Mark Thorne. He was the perfect friend. Almost too perfect. His grief was palpable, his loyalty to David absolute. But Rossi, a woman who had spent her career observing the complex, often deceptive nature of human relationships, saw something in the intensity of his devotion that felt off. It was more than friendship. It was a fierce, proprietary possessiveness. He wasn't just supporting David, he was guarding him, isolating him. It was a small, intuitive flicker of suspicion, a professional's gut instinct, with no evidence to support it. But it was there. She made a mental note to run a background check on the grieving best friend. It was just routine, but she had a feeling that, in this case, nothing was going to be as it seemed. In the weeks following Laura's funeral, a new, grim routine established itself. David existed in a state of suspended animation, his grief a heavy, disorienting fog. He stopped going to work, unable to summon the focus or the will to care about the clean, logical lines of architecture when the very structure of his own life was a pile of rubble. He spent his days wandering through the silent, empty rooms of his house, each object a painful reminder of the life that had been stolen from him. Mark remained his constant shadow, his caretaker, his lifeline. He managed David's affairs, cooked his meals, and acted as a gatekeeper, shielding him from the well-meaning but emotionally draining intrusions of the outside world. For Detective Rossi, the case had hit a frustrating wall. The public and her superiors were pressuring her to make an arrest, and the only viable suspect, David Morgan, was looking less and less likely. His alibi was unshakable, and the deep dive into his and Laura's financials and communications had revealed nothing but a genuinely happy, stable marriage. There was no motive. The case was growing cold, and Rossi was a detective who hated the cold. It was this frustration that led her to act on the faint, unsubstantiated suspicion she had about Mark Thorne. She ran the background check, and just as she had expected, it came back clean. He had no criminal record, not even a speeding ticket. He was a successful, respected businessman. But Rossi was a detective who believed that the truth of a person was not in the official records, but in the small, forgotten details of their lives. She started digging deeper unofficially. She spoke to former employees of Thorne's construction company. They all described him as a fair, demanding boss, a perfectionist. But one, a disgruntled foreman who had been fired a year ago, offered a small, interesting piece of information. "Mark's a strange one," the man had said. "He's all friendly on the surface, but he's got no real friends. Just David. His whole world revolves around that guy. Intense. Almost obsessive." The word obsessive snagged in Rossi's mind. She started to re-examine Mark's role in the investigation, not as a supportive friend, but as a potential actor. He had been the one to manage David, the one to speak for him. He had been present at every interview. Had he been supporting his friend, or had he been controlling the flow of information? She decided to talk to him again, this time without David present. She called him down to the station under the pretense of wanting to go over his witness statement one more time. Mark arrived, his demeanor the same as always. Calm, cooperative, and radiating a quiet, concerned strength. I just want to be clear on the timeline from the day Laura went missing. Rossi began, her tone casual. You and David were in a project meeting until what time? Exactly? Until about 4:30, Mark replied, his voice even. We left the site together. I dropped him at his house and then went to check on another job on the other side of town. It was the same story he had told a dozen times. But this time Rossi had done her homework. The other job, she said, leaning forward slightly. That would be the new commercial build-out by the old quarry? That's the one, Mark confirmed with a nod. That's funny, Rossi said, her eyes fixed on his. Because I spoke to the site supervisor this morning. He said you never showed up that afternoon. In fact, he said your crew had been sent home early because a shipment of materials had been delayed. The site was deserted after 3 p.m. For the first time since the investigation began, the mask of calm on Mark Thorne's face slipped. It was a micro-expression, a flicker of something cold and sharp in his eyes. There and gone in a second, but Rossi saw it. He must be mistaken, Mark said, his voice a little too tight. I was there. I did a walkthrough. And your phone records show you were in that area? Rossi pressed. I often turn my phone off when I'm on a site, he said smoothly, recovering his composure. Distractions can be dangerous. It was a lie and they both knew it. A small, almost insignificant lie about the last few hours of his day. But in a murder investigation, a small lie can be the loose thread that unravels everything. Rossi didn't push it. She had what she wanted. A crack in the perfect alibi, a flaw in the foundation of the perfect best friend. That night, Rossi did something that was a profound breach of protocol. She went to David's house alone. Mark was there as always. She asked to speak to David privately. Mark's immediate, instinctual resistance to the idea, his attempt to insert himself into the conversation, was all the confirmation she needed. She sat with David in his study, the room where he and his wife had spent so many quiet, happy evenings. David, she said gently, I know this is incredibly difficult, but I need you to think back to the day Laura disappeared. I need you to think about Mark. David looked at her, his expression a mixture of confusion and a deep, bone-weary grief. Mark? What about him? He's been my rock. I know he has, she said. But I need you to be a detective for a minute, not a grieving husband. I need you to look at things with a cold eye. In the weeks before Laura died, did you notice anything different about Mark? Any change in his behavior, no matter how small? David started to shake his head, but then he paused. He was a man who noticed details, who saw the world in terms of structure and pattern. His grief had clouded that ability, but Rossi's question was a sharp, clarifying stone dropped into the murky water of his memory. He was quieter, David said slowly, his mind drifting back. More intense. I thought it was just stress from work. And he started giving us gifts. Strange gifts. What kind of gifts? Rossi asked, her senses on high alert. A few weeks before she died, he gave us a new set of knives for the kitchen, David said. A professional chef's set. Laura thought it was an odd gift. We barely cook. And he gave me a new pair of heavy-duty work boots. Said my old ones were worn out. He was always doing things like that. Looking out for us. Knives, boots, the tools of a trade. Or the tools of a crime. Rossi's mind was racing. The day she disappeared, Rossi said, her voice low. After Mark dropped you home from the meeting, did he come inside? David shook his head. No. He said he was in a hurry. Had to get to the other site. Did you see what he was wearing? David closed his eyes, trying to picture it. His work clothes. Jeans. a flannel shirt, his work boots. His new boots, Rossi asked. The ones he gave you? David's eyes snapped open. No, he said, a dawning horror in his voice. His old ones, the ones that were worn out, covered in paint and drywall dust. And in that moment, another memory surfaced, a detail that had been meaningless at the time but was now screaming with significance. The night of the search, when Mark had come back to the house after hours of looking for Laura in the muddy, wooded riverbank. His boots had been clean, spotless. A man who had been searching in the mud for hours would not have clean boots, unless he had changed them, unless he had been wearing a different pair of boots for the search than he had been wearing earlier in the day. The new boots he had so thoughtfully given to David. The pieces began to crash together in David's mind. A horrifying, impossible mosaic. The lie about the job site, the strange, practical gifts, the clean boots. He looked at Rossi, his face a mask of disbelief and a new, burgeoning terror that was different from the grief. Why? He whispered, the question a raw, uncomprehending plea. Why would he lie? That's what I intend to find out, Rossi said. She knew she was close. The foundation of the unbreakable bond was not just flawed. It was rotten to the core. And she had a sickening feeling that when it finally collapsed, it would bring the entire tragic truth down with it. The revelation about the boots was a single, devastating crack that spiderwebbed through the entire foundation of David Morgan's life. The 20-year friendship, the unwavering loyalty, the unbreakable bond, it all began to crumble under the weight of a single, impossible suspicion. For the first time since Laura's death, the thick, suffocating fog of grief began to recede, replaced by the sharp, cold, and terrifying clarity of doubt. He spent the next 2 days in a state of torment, his mind a battlefield where a lifetime of trust waged a losing war against a mountain of horrifying new evidence. He replayed every conversation, every interaction with Mark from the past few months, viewing them now through this new, distorted lens. Mark's constant presence, which had once been a comfort, now seemed like a form of surveillance. His acts of kindness, like a jailer's. The way he had isolated David from other friends and family, which had seemed like protection, now felt like a strategic move to control the narrative, to ensure David's only source of information and comfort was the killer himself. The psychological whiplash was severe. To even consider Mark as a suspect felt like a betrayal of the highest order. This was the man who had been the best man at his wedding, the man who was the godfather to a child they had never had. This was his brother. But the logic, the cold, hard architectural logic that had always governed David's mind, was undeniable. The pieces fit. The clean boots, the lie about the job site, the strange, almost premeditated gifts of knives and boots. It was a blueprint for a murder. He knew he had to find the proof himself, the one piece of irrefutable evidence that would either confirm his monstrous suspicion or absolve his best friend and prove he was losing his mind. He knew where he had to look. Mark had a key to their house. He was in and out all the time. If he had killed Laura, if he had staged the scene, he might have made a mistake. He might have left something behind or taken something. He began to search his own home, not as its owner, but as a forensic investigator. He looked at every room with a stranger's eyes, searching for a single, discordant note in the familiar symphony of his life. He found it in Laura's art studio. Laura had been a creature of habit and meticulous organization when it came to her work. Her paints, her brushes, her canvases, everything had its place. At the back of the studio was a large, flat file where she kept her finished sketches and watercolors. David knew she had been working on a series of river landscapes just before she died. He opened the file. The new landscapes were there, but one was missing. It was a specific, large charcoal sketch of a twisted, ancient oak tree that grew at a bend in the river, a spot she had called her thinking place. She had shown it to him just a week before she disappeared, proud of how she had captured the tree's gnarled, almost human-like form. It was her favorite piece from the new series. And it was gone. Why would a killer take a sketch? It made no sense. Unless the killer wasn't a stranger. Unless the killer was someone who knew its significance, someone who wanted a memento, a trophy. Or, David's mind reeled, unless the sketch itself contained evidence. Had she sketched something else on that day? Had she been a witness to something? The thought was a jolt of pure adrenaline. He went back through Laura's things, her hiking pack, her clothes from that day, which the police had returned to him. He found her small, portable sketching kit. Tucked into a side pocket, he found a small, single sheet of charcoal paper, torn from a larger pad. On it was a quick, rough sketch. It was not a landscape. It was a portrait, a profile of a man, his back to her, standing by the riverbank. He was wearing a flannel shirt and work boots, and he was dragging something heavy towards the water. The sketch was rough, unfinished, but the man's posture, the set of his shoulders, the specific, worn-out work boots, it was unmistakably Mark. The world went silent. The air in the room grew thin. David stared at the small, damning piece of paper, the last thing his wife had ever created. She had not been murdered by a random stranger. She had been murdered by his best friend. And she had, in her final moments, drawn a picture of her own killer. He had likely come upon her while she was sketching, perhaps in the act of disposing of something else, or perhaps he had followed her there. She had seen him, and he had killed her to silence her. But then he had taken the primary sketch, not realizing she had made this smaller, quicker one. The full, monstrous truth crashed down upon David with the force of a physical blow. He fell to his knees, the small sketch clutched in his hand, a sound of pure, animal agony tearing from his throat. It was a sound of grief, of rage, and of the profound, soul-shattering pain of the ultimate betrayal. He knew what he had to do. He couldn't just go to the police. This was not about the law. This was about him and Mark. This was about the brother who had murdered his wife. He needed to hear it from him. He needed to look him in the eye and see the monster he had called his friend for 20 years. He called Mark. His voice was a strange, dead calm. "Mark, can you come over?" he said. "I found something of Laura's. I need you to see it." Mark agreed immediately, his voice full of the same practiced, concerned warmth. "Of course, Dave. I'm on my way." David waited in the living room, the room where their lives had so often played out. He placed the small charcoal sketch on the coffee table. He sat on the sofa and waited. The quiet of the house was no longer empty. It was filled with the ghosts of 20 years of lies. Mark arrived, letting himself in with his own key, as he always did. "Hey," he said, his smile warm, his eyes full of concern. "What is it? Are you okay?" "Sit down, Mark," David said, his voice a low, dangerous thing he didn't recognize. Mark's smile faltered. He saw the look on David's face, the cold, dead calm, and he knew. He saw the sketch on the table. The mask, the one he had worn for decades, the one of the loyal, loving friend, finally, irrevocably, fell away. His face changed. The warmth vanished, replaced by a cold, weary resignation. He looked at David, and there was no remorse in his eyes, only a strange, profound sadness. "I did it for you, you know," Mark said, his voice a quiet, conversational whisper. "I did it for us." The words made no sense. "For us," David choked out, his mind reeling. "You murdered my wife. You destroyed my life. For us." Mark sank into the armchair opposite him, a man surrendering to a long, inevitable fate. "Her," he said, the word a drop of pure venom. "She was the one destroying you. Can't you see? She was a cancer. She was pulling you away, making you soft. Our friendship, what we had, it was being diluted. She was always there, in the middle. I wanted it to be like it was before. Just you and me. The two of us. The way it was always supposed to be." And in that moment, the final, most horrific layer of the deception was peeled back. Mark hadn't killed Laura because he was in love with her. He had killed her because he was in love, in his own twisted, obsessive, and proprietary way, with David. She was not the object of his desire. She was the obstacle to it. David stared at the man he had called his brother, and he saw a complete and total stranger, a monster who had hidden in plain sight. His love so twisted it had become a murderous, possessive force. The betrayal was not just about the murder. It was about every shared memory, every moment of their friendship, which had been, for Mark, a lie, a performance designed to keep David close, to keep him for himself. "You're insane," David whispered, the full, crushing weight of the truth finally settling upon him. "No," Mark said, a faint, sad smile on his lips. "I was just loyal to the wrong thing, I suppose." He looked at the sketch, at the final, damning piece of evidence. "She was a good artist," he said quietly. "She always captured the truth of things." The confession, delivered not with the rage of a cornered killer but with the quiet, sorrowful resignation of a doomed lover, hung in the silent living room, a monstrous, radioactive truth that poisoned the very air. David stared at Mark, the man he had known his entire life, and saw only the hollowed-out shell of his friendship, a vessel for a madness he could never have conceived. "All those years," David whispered, his voice a raw, broken rasp. "Our friendship, was it all just this? A lie?" "No," Mark said, and for the first time, a flicker of genuine pain crossed his face. "It was real. It was the only real thing in my life. You were the only real thing. She was the lie, the intrusion. I was just trying to fix it, to restore the foundation." The word foundation was a bitter, architectural irony that was not lost on David. Mark, the builder, the man who prided himself on creating strong, unshakable structures, had just confessed to demolishing the very foundation of David's world in order to save it. In that moment, David was not a grieving husband or a betrayed friend. He was a man pushed beyond the brink, a man whose entire reality had been a carefully constructed deception. A cold, clear rage, purer and more absolute than anything he had ever known, rose up in him. He lunged. He was not a fighter, he was an architect, a man of paper and pencils. But the fury gave him a strength he didn't know he possessed. He crashed into Mark, sending them both tumbling over the coffee table, the charcoal sketch fluttering to the floor like a black, dead leaf. The fight was a clumsy, brutal, desperate thing. It was not a battle of skill, but of pure, raw, emotional violence. They rolled on the floor, surrounded by the ghosts of their shared history, their friendship dissolving into a flurry of grunts and curses, and the sickening thud of fists against flesh. The struggle ended as suddenly as it began. In the chaos, they had knocked over a heavy, brass floor lamp. David's hand closed around its heavy base. He swung it, a single, desperate, unthinking act of pure, final severance. The base connected with the side of Mark's head with a dull, heavy thud. Mark went limp, a sudden, dead weight. David scrambled back, his chest heaving, his hands trembling. He stared at the still form of his best friend, a dark, spreading pool of blood beginning to form on the light-colored rug. The silence that descended was absolute, a profound, deafening quiet after the storm. It was in this silent, bloody tableau that Detective Rossi found them. She had been on her way to the house, armed with a new piece of evidence fibers from Mark's truck, found on a microscopic snag on Laura's jacket and a warrant. She had been coming to arrest Mark. She had not been expecting to walk into a second murder scene. The legal aftermath was a complex, emotionally fraught process. David confessed immediately, his voice a monotone, his eyes dead. The story he told, supported by the charcoal sketch and the evidence Rossi had independently gathered, painted a clear, undeniable picture of Mark Thorne's guilt and the profound, psychological torment that had led to David's own act of violence. The district attorney, faced with a jury that would be deeply sympathetic to a man who had been so horrifically betrayed, offered a deal. Manslaughter, a reduced sentence, given the extreme emotional duress. David accepted. He didn't care. The legal proceedings were just a footnote, a bureaucratic epilogue to a story that had already ended. He served 2 years in a low-security prison, a quiet, orderly place that, in a strange way, felt more like a sanctuary than his own empty home. He had time to think, to process the layered, complex nature of the tragedy. He had lost his wife and he had killed his best friend. But he had also come to realize that the friend he had killed had died long before that night, replaced by a monster of obsession. And the man he had been, the quiet, happy architect, had died with Laura, on a trail by the river. When he was released, he did not return to the craftsman bungalow. He sold it and everything in it. He could not live amongst the ghosts. He left the town, the state, and moved to a small, anonymous city by the sea, a place with no history for him, no memories. He did not practice architecture again. The idea of building things, of creating structures designed for life and happiness, felt like a bitter, cruel joke. His own life's foundation had been a deadly deception, and he could no longer trust in the integrity of any structure. He found a quiet, solitary job as a draftsman, a simple, mechanical task of translating other people's designs into clean, emotionless lines. He lived alone in a small, sparse apartment overlooking the water. His life was quiet again, but it was not the warm, contented quiet of his past. It was a cold, empty silence, the silence of a man who has had everything, and everyone, taken from him. The unbreakable bond was broken. The perfect life was a ruin. The deception was over. But its legacy was a life sentence of a different kind. A quiet, lonely existence where David Morgan, the sole survivor of a terrible secret war, was left to forever sift through the ashes, trying to find the point where the brother he had loved had become the monster he had been forced to destroy.